So the next thing I want to talk about with conditionals, and this is one of the places it starts to get a little hard, are necessary and sufficient conditions. So look, I'm gonna give you guys a roundabout kind of abstract definition, which I just took from the Lavin book, and then I'll explain a bit more what each of these mean. Necessary condition is, I think, the harder of the two. Sufficient condition is pretty intuitive. Then we'll talk about how to symbolize them. And these are important because necessary conditions pop up a lot. They pop up a lot in law, especially. You'll hear like necessary conditions for fulfilling a contract or, things like that. So anyway, what is a necessary condition? A is a necessary condition for B means for B to obtain, and just obtain is a fancy way of saying happen, be true, etc. Then A must obtain, happen, be true, etc. All right. Well, what does that actually mean, right? Well, I think that the easiest way to get your head around what this means is if we look at examples. Here's some examples of necessary conditions. And I've put this in the language of necessary conditions, even though this isn't the way you'll usually see these things written, right? Being 35, or at least 35, is a necessary condition for becoming president of the US, right? Completing all your tests in logic is a necessary condition for getting an A in logic, right? Just mathematically, if you don't take all your tests, you're not going to get an A in the course, right? Being warm-blooded is a necessary condition for being a mammal, right? Something doesn't have warm blood, it's not a mammal, right? Being at least 3 foot 8 inches, is a necessary condition for riding Space Mountain. I Googled this. This is actually how tall you have to be to ride Space Mountain at Disney World. Being at least 21 is a necessary condition for legally buying beer in the U.S. Every state in the union, you have to be at least 21. It's actually set at the state level, but the federal government will yank all your highway money if you don't set it at least that. They actually had a big war with the state of Louisiana over this, who wanted to have an 18 drinking age. Anyway, so anywhere in the U.S., you got to be at least 21 to buy beer, right? Buying a lottery ticket is a necessary condition for winning the lottery. Passing the state licensure test is a necessary condition for getting a registered nurse's license in Virginia. Passing the bar is a necessary condition for practicing law in Virginia. Now, you usually won't see it written like this, right? In ordinary language, when someone says, they'll say, well, you must be 35 years old to become president, right? That'll be a way, I forget how the Constitution puts it, but you'll see something like that. Or you have to do all the tests to get an A in the course. Or you might see something must be warm-blooded to be a mammal. If you go to Disney World, you'll probably see you must be at least this tall to ride the ride. I can't remember. I think I was barely 3'8" when we went to Disney World. I remember we rode Space Mountain, but whatever. I remember I was tall enough to ride, and that was all that mattered to little me, right? You might see something, you must have been born after this date to buy beer, right? Or buy alcohol. Someone might say, you have to buy a ticket to win the lottery, or you can't win unless you play, something like that, right? All of these ways of putting it are just getting at this idea of necessary conditions. Necessary conditions, I think, are the harder of these two, but I think if you just look at a lot of examples, it's not that hard, right? Sufficient conditions are the easier of the two, both to symbolize and I think to get our heads around. A is a sufficient condition for B means whenever A happens, is true, whenever A obtains is true, happens whatever B obtains. Let's look at some sufficient conditions, right? Sticking to a well-planned diet is a sufficient condition for losing weight. For most people it is, right? It's really hard to stick to a well-planned diet, but if you can do it, you will lose weight, right? Most people. Falling 5,000 feet onto concrete is a sufficient condition for dying. Sorry for the gruesome examples, but I think if you ask any logic professor, they will tell you that the more memorable, often the more gruesome a condition is. Sorry, an example is the more it sticks in people's heads. So, sorry, but people tend to remember this. Scoring more runs than the other team is a sufficient condition for winning the baseball game. Getting caught committing plagiarism is a sufficient condition for failing Philosophy 101. At least it is when I'm teaching it, because if I catch students plagiarizing, I am really, really hard-nosed about that. I will fail them, right? Doing well on a placement test is a sufficient condition for enrolling in intermediate German. Getting 270 votes is a sufficient condition for becoming president of the U.S. Blowing .1 on a breathalyzer is a sufficient condition for getting a DUI. Getting hit by a baseball flying at high speed is a sufficient condition for breaking an ordinary window. Now look, one thing I want you to notice immediately, in cases of necessary conditions, A has to be true for B, right? You have to be 35 to become president. You have to be 3'8" to ride Space Mountain. You have to pass the bar exam to practice law in this state. For sufficient conditions, there are generally other ways for these things to happen, right? You know, there are other ways to fail Philosophy 101, right? If you plagiarize your assignments, you will fail. If you just don't turn in any of them, you will also fail, right? You know, doing well on a placement test is one way to enroll in intermediate German, but, well, you know, if you take German 101, German 102, intermediate German is the next in there, you can also enroll, right? There's other ways to do it. With sufficient conditions, the sufficient condition is generally one way for the thing to happen or one way to qualify for the thing. It's not the only way, right? Getting 270 electoral votes is sufficient for becoming president. It's not the only way, right? If you are vice president and the president dies, that is another way to become president. Blowing .1 on a breathalyzer is sufficient for getting a DUI in Virginia, but actually so is blowing .8, .08, .09. You know, I think the law says, you know, you don't even have to blow that if you're obviously intoxicated, you know. If you drive your car off the sidewalk into a store window and the cops come and breathalyze you and you get .07, I'm going to guess you're also going to get a DUI, right? Getting hit by a baseball flying at high speed is a sufficient condition for breaking a window. There's lots of other ways to break a window. You can hit it with a rock. You can hit it with a hammer, you know, so on and so forth, right? So, necessary conditions, you have to have the necessary condition to get the thing it's a necessary condition for. Sufficient conditions, generally speaking, most of the time with sufficient conditions, it's one way to get the thing, it's not the only way, right? You know, won't bore you with the rules of baseball. Makes me sad, but a lot of students don't follow or know baseball. But, you know, right, there's other ways to lose a baseball game, right? If your fans riot during a home game, you will forfeit. That is another way to lose a baseball, you know, game. If the other team's fans riot, you win, right? Forfeit's another way to do this. I used to follow, I don't follow baseball as closely as I used to. I used to follow the White Sox. I lived in Chicago for a while. And for a long time, the White Sox had the dubious distinction of being the last team to forfeit a game because their fans rioted. Just really shameful, awful, you know, little bit in baseball history. I mean, Disco Demolition Night. Look it up. The fans rioted for just completely crappy reasons, too. Um, White Sox were also the team that threw the World Series because they were bribed. Anyway, why did I follow this team? Because the Cubs fans are insufferable yuppies, but won't get into that, right? So how do we symbolize sufficient conditions? Sufficient conditions are pretty easy, right? I mean, think of the way you would usually put this. If a speeding baseball hits a normal window, it will break. If you blow .1 on a breathalyzer test in Virginia, you will get a DUI. How would you symbolize that? Well, it's just an if-then statement, right? A equals speeding baseball hits a normal window. B equals the window breaks. A arrow B. You blow .1 on a breathalyzer test, you get a DUI. B equals you blow .1. D, you get a DUI. B arrow D, right? Easy, easy, easy. Now note, you will sometimes see, and we'll talk more about this later, sometimes conditional statements won't be written in this neat, pretty if-then form. And one common way they're not is with sufficient conditions, you'll sometimes see it written as when or whenever, right? Whenever a speeding baseball hits a window, the window will break. Even though we don't see our if-then, that is an if-then statement. When you blow a .1 on a breathalyzer in Virginia, you will get a DUI, right? We'll talk more about this, when we talk about symbolizing, translating tricky conditionals, but just keep this in mind. Well, how to symbolize necessary conditions? Well, let's look at two. You must be 35 to become president of the U.S., or at least 35. To win the lottery, you have to buy a ticket. So there's an tempting but obviously wrong way to symbolize these. T, you were at least 35. P, you become president of the U.S. T, arrow P, right? Why is that obviously wrong? Well, you don't automatically become president of the U.S. when you hit 35, right? I mean, thank God, like the idea of like when you become 35, you have to lead the country. Someone who's over 35, I don't want to be president, right? That'd be terrifying. And sadly, T, you buy a ticket, L, you win the lottery. Sadly, you have to do a bit more than buy a ticket. It's not true that T, arrow L, every time you buy a ticket, you win. The right way to symbolize necessary conditions. T equals you are at least 35. P equals you become president of the U.S. If you become president of the U.S., you are at least 35. To win the lottery, you have to buy a ticket. L, arrow T, right? And why is this? We'll think of our conditional. If you are president, we know you're at least 35, right? That conditional is true. If you're president, you are at least 35. And, leaving aside people who might have gotten a ticket given to them or whatever, we can, But if you win the lottery, you have to have a ticket. Unless somebody gives it to you, you have to have bought the ticket, right? All right. A is a necessary condition for B equals, you reverse the order, right? B arrow A. That's how we symbolize necessary condition. The necessary condition is always after the little arrow. It's always, to use our logical jargon, in the position of the consequent. Okay, hopefully this idea of necessary and sufficient conditions makes sense to you guys. People have some trouble with it, but I think the way to get it is just look at examples, look at examples, look at examples. It's really not that complicated when you do. It's hard to explain in a good way, but I think examples make it clear, hopefully. Also, hopefully clear why we symbolize both the way we do.